So I said in the last video I was going to start on logical fallacies in this video, but I first wanted to talk a bit more about the conditionals, and then in the next video I'll start on the logical fallacies. And so I've been kind of calling these hypotheticals, which is sort of the Kantian way of talking about them, but and I've kind of been immersed in Kant because of my other playlist, but I think they are usually called conditionals, and we'll actually see why they're called conditionals here in a little bit. Well, I guess just kind of a spoiler. It's because the if part, the antecedent, is sort of a condition of the consequent. But anyway, so I talked about in the last video about the if-then statements, and I gave this truth table, but I didn't really give a good explanation of the truth table because a lot of people might look at it and think, well, if one of these things are false, then how can the if-then statement still be true? And so in this, we're talking more about sort of validity than actual soundness, is probably a good way to put it. And so we're saying that, say if it's raining, so if rain, then wet is true. So if we say if rain then wet, then we say, well, if it is raining, if we sort of affirm the antecedent, then it's wet. But it's also true that if it's not raining, then we could say either it is wet or we could say it is not wet, and it would still be true because, and as we'll talk about in a little bit, this is a with if then rather than if and only if. This is a sufficient condition, but it's not a necessary condition for it to be wet. And so even if it is not raining, then it could be true that it is wet, or it could be true that it is not wet. But we're saying that if it is not wet, so this one right here, if it is not wet, and it is raining, that is a false statement. So by denying the consequent, we're saying that it cannot be true that it is raining, and so that is why only this second one here is false. We'll see that's a little bit different when we're talking about if and only if. All right, and so another thing I wanted to point out, so a lot of times you'll see this here where the if and only if, so, or if P then Q rather, is equal to not P or not Q. And so in logic, I think a lot of people, a lot of logicians like to try to keep things as simple as possible. And so there's always this way of trying to get things so with as few different kinds of operators as possible. And so here we're using the not, and we're using the or and rather. That's the and operator. And so there's this thing in logic where people like try to boil everything down to using only not and operators. And so these things are logically equivalent, saying if P then Q is logically equivalent to not P and not Q. And so if we say, look at if it is raining outside, then it is wet outside, is logically equivalent to not it is raining outside and not wet outside. Because it's saying that it cannot be both raining outside and not wet outside. So that is this second one here. And so it's saying, like I said, that it cannot be both raining outside and not wet outside. So that's sort of the denying the or denying the consequent rather. And so those two things are logically equivalent. And so that goes into that sort of logician's thing of trying to get everything in terms of not and operators. So if you're ever trying to teach yourself logic, that's something you'll probably run into. And they try to get like the or operator in terms of the just the and not operators and things like that. So another thing I wanted to point out is this thing called constructive dilemma. And so that's if we have two different if statements, if then statements. So if P then Q, if R then S, and then we have P or R, therefore Q or S. So uh, we have the two antecedents. So antecedent 1 or antecedent 2, therefore consequent 1 or consequent 2. And so this is an example that I copied off of Wikipedia. So if I win $1 million, I will donate it to an orphanage is our if P then Q. If my friend wins $1 million, then he will donate it to a wildlife fund. So that is our if R then S. And so then either I win $1 million or my friend wins $1 million. So that is our P or S. Therefore, either an orphanage will get $1 million or a wildlife fund will get $1 million. And so that's just kind of a way of kind of combining these two if then statements. And I think, especially putting it in this concrete form, most people will be pretty comfortable seeing that this is actually true. I won't go through like the whole proof of this because that's kind of beside the point. All right, so then the other thing to talk about is the if and only if statements, which, as we see here, now this third row here has this false, which means that we are allowed to deny the antecedent. And so a lot of times you'll see if and only if written as this IFF. And so that just means if and only if. And so the difference with this, so if is just talking about sufficiency, where sufficiency is it's all that's needed to be true for the consequent to be true, but it need not be true for the consequent to be true. And so that goes to our third row here. So all that needs to be true is for it to be true, but it need not be true. I said before the example of, say, if rain then wet, we say it's not raining. Well, it could still be wet because of some other thing. So rain is sufficient for it to be wet, but it's not necessary for it to be wet. But then if we add this only if in, that gives us necessity. And so if we say, if and only if it is raining, then it is wet outside. So we're, saying that only if it is raining, then it could ever be wet outside. That raining is necessary for it to be wet outside. So necessity equal a condition that needs to obtain or needs to be true for the consequent to be true. If the necessary condition does not obtain, then the consequent cannot obtain. So the antecedent must be true for the consequent to be true. And so I put here, so if and only if it is raining outside, then it is wet outside. Usually these kinds of conditionals are written sort of reversed like this. So it's wet outside if and only if it is raining outside. So you'll see it sort of swapped around that way. So that's probably the way that you'll often see is kind of the way that seems sort of more grammatically to flow off the tongue. It's wet outside if and only if it's raining outside, rather than if and only if it is raining outside, then it is wet outside. All right, so with if and only if, P and Q can substitute each other. And so these are equivalent statements. So if and only if it is raining outside, then it is wet outside is equivalent to if and only if it is wet outside, then it is raining outside, because we have said that denying the antecedent is allowed, and so if we just turn the antecedent into the consequent, then it is logically equivalent. And so that is what if and only if is. And I guess if you wanted to, have only if, so only if only if rain then wet. And so we are saying that rain is a necessary but not sufficient condition. And so only if it's raining will it be wet outside, but there might need to be some other additional condition in order for it to be wet outside. But we're saying that if we're using only if without just the if, then we're saying that rain is necessary, but not, but it might not be sufficient for it to be wet outside. And so, like I said, this is why these are called conditionals here, because we're saying that the antecedent is a condition of the consequent. And if we're using only if, then it is a sufficient condition, and then only if means it is a necessary condition. And so if and only if means that the antecedent is a necessary and sufficient condition for the consequent to be true. All right, so in the next video, like I said, I will be going over logical fallacies, which are the way that sort of logic can go wrong. So you may have heard of cognitive fallacies, which are sort of the popular ones, things like confirmation bias and things like that, which, and I'll talk about those actually in a later video down the line, but in the next video, I'm going to start talking about logical fallacies, which are essentially the ways that logic can be misused or you know, used in a way that can be sort of easily misinterpreted as seeming like it's logically valid, but they are not. It's not actually logically valid. But anyway, like I said, I'll get to that in the next video. I hope you found this video helpful, and I will see you in the next one.